Dog dung collector. Imagine that your job every morning is to walk through the streets searching for dog droppings. In Britain during the 19th century, there were people who worked in a strange profession known as dog dung collectors or pure finders. They carried buckets or bags and walked through alleys and markets looking for dog droppings. Then they collected them by hand and sold them to leather tanneries. But why would tanneries pay money for something like this? After hair was removed from animal hides, the hides remained stiff and still contained traces of lime and unwanted tissue, so they were soaked in a mixture that included dog dung. The enzymes in it helped break down certain proteins, remove leftover lime, and make the leather softer and more flexible until it was ready for tanning and for making shoes and bags. The dry and relatively clean droppings were the most valuable, so much so that the people in this trade called them pure. But the job was not only strange, it was also disgusting and dangerous. Workers touched the waste directly and were exposed all day to germs, parasites, and foul smells. At a time when gloves and protective equipment were not available to everyone. As the leather industry developed, and safer chemicals and industrial enzymes appeared, this profession gradually disappeared. But for a period in history, what dogs left behind in the streets was a valuable material that an entire part of the leather industry depended on. Medicinal leech collector. Imagine that your job is to stand inside a swamp with your legs exposed until leeches attach themselves to your body and suck your blood. In past centuries, doctors used leeches to draw blood from patients, believing it could help treat fevers, headaches, and inflammation. That is why a profession appeared known as the medicinal leech collector. The worker would enter ponds and swamps, let the leeches attach to his legs, then pull them off and place them in containers to sell them to doctors and pharmacies. But the job was painful and dangerous. The worker could lose a significant amount of blood and suffer cuts and infections, especially when doing the work day after day. As medicine advanced, the use of leeches declined, and this profession gradually disappeared. But medicinal leeches are still used today in some procedures to help improve blood flow after delicate surgeries. Corpse guard. Imagine that your job every night is to sit beside a fresh grave and watch it until morning, not out of fear that the dead person might rise, but out of fear that someone might come and steal the body. In Britain during the 18th and 19th centuries, a phenomenon spread known as body snatching. At the time, medical schools needed real human bodies so students could study anatomy and learn surgery. But the law allowed them to obtain only a limited number of corpses, usually the bodies of executed criminals. As the number of medical students increased, the bodies available became far fewer than what was needed. And this is where thieves known as grave robbers or resurrectionists appeared. They would wait for a newly buried person, then come to the cemetery at night, dig up the grave quickly, remove the body, and sell it to doctors or anatomy schools. To protect their dead, some families began hiring men to guard the graves. The guard would remain in the cemetery throughout the night and watch the grave for several days or weeks, until the body began to decompose and lost its value to the body snatchers. In some cemeteries, small rooms were built especially for the guards. They were known as watch houses. The guard would sit inside, look out over the graves through a window, and carry a lantern and a stick, and sometimes a weapon to defend himself. But the work was not easy. The guard spent the night among the graves, in the cold and darkness, sometimes facing gangs willing to fight in order to take the body. Some families did not rely on guards alone. They placed heavy iron cages over the graves, known as mort safes, to stop thieves from reaching the coffin. In 1832, Britain passed the Anatomy Act, which allowed bodies to be supplied for medical education through wider legal channels. After that, demand for stolen bodies declined, and grave robbing gradually began to disappear. And with it disappeared one of the strangest jobs in history. A man spending his night beside a grave to make sure the dead stayed where they were. Human alarm clock. Imagine waking up every morning, not to the sound of your phone and not to the ringing of an alarm clock, but to a person standing outside your home, tapping on your window with a long stick. Before cheap and reliable alarm clocks became widespread, a strange profession appeared in Britain and Ireland known as the human alarm clock. The person who did this job was called a knocker-up. Workers would pay them a small amount to wake them at a specific time every morning so they would not be late for factories, mines, and ports. The human alarm clock would begin work before sunrise, walking through the streets with a notebook containing the names of customers and the time each one needed to wake up. When they reached a house, they would knock on the door or window with a short stick. But if the customer lived on an upper floor, they would use a very long pole, one that could reach the window of the second or third floor. Some of them used a small tube and blew dried peas through it at the window glass until the person inside woke up. But tapping the window once was not enough. The knocker-up would wait until they saw movement inside the room or heard the customer's voice to make sure they had actually woken up. Then they quickly moved on to the next house. They had to be extremely punctual because being just a few minutes late could cause a worker to miss the start of their shift and perhaps have their wages reduced or lose their job. But here comes a strange question. Who woke up the human alarm clock? Most likely, they relied on their own clock, went to sleep early, or stayed awake until their work began before dawn. This profession continued in some British cities until the middle of the 20th century. But as cheap electric alarm clocks spread, people no longer needed someone to knock on their windows every morning. So the profession gradually disappeared. And so, before waking up became the job of a small phone beside the bed, there was once a person walking through the darkness, waking an entire city one window at a time. Ice cutter. Imagine that your job in winter is to stand on a frozen lake and cut the ice into massive blocks. Before electric refrigerators became widespread, people relied on natural ice to preserve food and cool drinks. That is why a profession appeared known as the ice cutter. Workers would wait until lakes and rivers had frozen solid, then walk out onto the surface carrying saws, axes, and long sharp tools. At first, they would clear the snow from the surface of the lake. Then, they would mark straight lines across the ice and divide it into large, even squares. After that, they began cutting the ice along those lines until the blocks separated from one another. But removing these blocks was not easy. A single block could be extremely heavy, so workers used hooks and ropes. Then push the blocks through narrow water channels until they reached the shore. From there, the ice was moved into special buildings called ice houses. The blocks were stacked on top of one another and covered with sawdust or straw to slow their melting as much as possible. Later, they were sold to homes, restaurants, and hospitals. Sometimes, they were even transported by ship to distant cities and countries. But the job was extremely dangerous. Workers stood for hours on a slippery surface in brutally low temperatures, and one mistake in judging the thickness of the ice could cause it to break, sending a worker into the freezing water. Heavy saws and axes, as well as sliding blocks of ice, could also cause serious injuries. With the rise of modern refrigerators and machine-made ice, demand for natural ice began to disappear. Over time, the profession of ice cutting almost vanished. But more than a century ago, the food that reached people cold in summer sometimes depended on men who spent the entire winter cutting frozen lakes one block after another.